They thought she was invisible. A quiet figure in a black uniform, moving silently between the chandeliers and velvet curtains, carrying trays that seemed heavier than her presence. Nobody looked twice at the waitress in worn cuffs and a silver watch scratched from years of wear. In a room where money glittered louder than the chandeliers, she was a shadow, meant to pass unseen. But sometimes shadows hold stories the light cannot bear. And tonight, under the hum of jazz and the clink of crystal glasses, the shadow was about to step into focus. Her name was Hoa Karen. The restaurant, La Lumiere, was one of Manhattan's temples of power, where million-dollar deals floated across linen tablecloths as effortlessly as the wine that filled their glasses. The air smelled of truffle oil and aged Bordeaux. Every corner glowed with curated luxury, polished mahogany floors, staff uniforms pressed so sharp they seemed cut from glass, chandeliers dripping golden firelight. Men in tailored suits leaned back with the ease of those who believed the world bent for them. Women draped in velvet and diamonds laughed with voices, tuned for performance, each soundbite calculated for an audience of rivals. It was a place where appearances were currency, and currency was everything. And yet, in this cathedral of excess, Hoa Karen moved with a grace that made her nearly invisible. Her dark hair was tied in a simple bun, no earrings, no makeup, no flash. Only that silver watch ticked steadily at her wrist, as though time itself answered to her calm rhythm. She balanced trays with quiet precision, her steps soundless over the marble floors. To most eyes, she was nothing more than a servant, another body in black slipping between the glittering elite. But her eyes told another story, sharp, steady, taking in every detail. She was not watching, she was observing, and that made all the difference. At the center of the room, under the brightest chandelier, sat Victor Reinhardt, the kind of man who never needed to introduce himself. A German billionaire, his name stirred whispers in financial circles, his presence a storm of arrogance wrapped in a steel-cut suit. He leaned back in his chair, every fold of his tailored navy suit screaming precision, his cufflinks catching the light like small daggers. At his side perched Lucas Meyer, his assistant thin, restless, his smirk carved into his face like it had been rehearsed. Together they radiated the kind of superiority that thrived on reminding others of their place. Victor barely glanced at Hoa when she approached their table. He turned to Lucas, muttering in German, his voice smooth but cold. "This restaurant hires servers like this?" Hopefully she can remember the dishes without dropping them. Lucas chuckled too loud, his eyes sliding over Hoa's plain uniform, as though it told her whole life story. Around them, a couple at a neighboring table leaned closer, curious. They couldn't hear the words, but they could sense the tone dismissive, cruel, meant to draw blood in silence. Hoa bent slightly, her pen poised above a small notepad tucked into her apron. She did not flinch, did not blink. "Yes, sir," she said softly in English, her tone deferential, almost too polite. Yet for a fleeting second, her eyes lifted to catch Victor's calm, unbroken, sharp as glass. It was only a moment, but it lingered like a spark in dry air. The other tables noticed. A woman in a red velvet dress whispered to her date, "Is that new waitress from a diner? She looks out of place." Her date, a man with a platinum watch the size of a fist, smirked without looking up from his phone. The laughter that followed was quiet but deliberate, meant to sting, but Hoa kept moving, her tray balanced, her steps even, her face unreadable. What none of them knew was that Hoa Karen had grown up in a world far more gilded than the one she now served. Born into a family whose name owned half the Saigon skyline, later educated in Berlin, she had walked marble halls before these men could afford their first suit. She had debated trade policy in lecture halls filled with diplomats' sons, won awards in economics while her professors nodded in approval. Fluency in 4 languages had been her inheritance, dignity her armor. But wealth was not why she was here tonight. Her story was stitched with sacrifice, and her presence in this restaurant was no accident. Still, to the glittering crowd, she was a ghost carrying their plates. And that was the beauty of it, because ghosts see everything. Victor flicked his menu across the table, the corner brushing Hoa's hand with a dismissive snap. "Remember this," he sneered, his German sharp enough to cut. "Or do they teach nothing at waitress school?" Lucas barked out a laugh, the sound sharp as glass breaking. A few heads turned, sensing a performance. Power always drew an audience, and cruelty was its favorite stage. Hoa picked up the menu, smoothed the edge with her thumb, and nodded. "Yes, sir," she repeated. Her voice was soft, steady, untouched by the insult. She turned away, her bun swaying lightly at the nape of her neck as she moved back into the tide of the restaurant. The moment passed like smoke, but it lingered in the air, a thread of tension weaving through the clinking glasses and drifting jazz. People began to watch her differently now, curiosity stirring like embers. No one could guess yet that the quiet waitress, the shadow with the silver watch, carried a truth sharper than any insult, a truth that would unravel reputations and leave this glittering room in silence before the night was over. The laughter didn't fade when Hoa Karen stepped away from Victor Reinhardt's table. It seemed to grow louder, spreading like a ripple across the polished room. Power was contagious, and cruelty, in the hands of men like Victor, was entertainment. The chandeliers glittered brighter for those who watched, eager for a scene that promised discomfort for someone they considered beneath them. And tonight, the spectacle was a waitress with steady hands and an old silver watch. Victor leaned back, swirling his wine with practiced arrogance. His voice carried just enough for nearby tables to catch. People like her dream of sitting at these tables, but they'll never get there. His German flowed smooth as poison. Lucas Meyer leaned forward, grinning, his eyes darting over Hoa's retreating figure. "Bet she's never even tasted this wine. What a pity," he added, in English this time, loud enough to invite laughter from the next table. Heads turned. The insult was too sweet for some to resist. Hoa reappeared with a tray of martinis, her balance perfect, her expression unchanged. She slid glasses onto a table where hedge fund brokers lounged like kings, their ties loosened, their laughter too loud. One of them, a red-faced man with a voice that had no volume control, waved at her like summoning a pet. "Hey, sweetheart," he barked, holding up his glass. "You forgot the lemon twist." "What, they don't teach you that in waitress school?" The men roared, their glasses clinking as they leaned back in amusement. Hoa paused. Her hand rested lightly on the rim of the glass, and for the first time, she looked directly at him. Her gaze wasn't angry. It was steady, deliberate. "My apologies," she said softly. Her words were quiet, almost tender, but her eyes locked on his just long enough to leave him blinking. She moved with calm precision to the bar, returned moments later with a perfect slice of lemon twist, and placed it into his drink. No flourish, no smile, just a nod before she turned away. The broker's smirk faltered. He muttered something into his glass, but the bite had gone from his voice. The room noticed that she didn't flinch, didn't break, and that unsettled them more than a sharp retort ever could. Victor, not one to surrender his stage, raised his voice. "Let's test her memory," he said, his German rolling quick and cruel. He rattled off a string of dishes, complicated enough to confuse a trained chef. Duck confit with a sauce no American could pronounce, a delicate sea base layered with truffle foam, a pasta with ingredients that sounded like a spell. Lucas jumped in, adding sides with a grin, roasted asparagus, truffle mashed potatoes, salad dressing on the side. They spoke faster and faster, their voices sharp, almost gleeful, eyes turned toward Hoa, waiting to see her stumble. This was the humiliation Victor wanted: a forgotten order, a dropped tray, a note of panic. But Hoa didn't touch her notepad. She stood calmly, hands folded in front of her apron, listening. When they finished, she inclined her head. "Yes, sir." Her voice was a whisper, but it cut clean through the room. She turned, unhurried, and disappeared into the kitchen. Whispers filled the air. "She didn't write a thing. She's finished." Waitress roulette. The laughter sharpened, but beneath it was a hum of something else: curiosity. The tension coiled tighter when a woman in pearls, her hair pinned in a perfect chignon, stopped Hoa as she passed with another tray. Her voice dripped with sugar but carried venom underneath. "Excuse me, dear, your apron has a stain." She gestured toward a faint smudge barely visible in the golden light. "It's a bit unprofessional, don't you think?" Her companions tittered, eyes sweeping Hoa's uniform like they were assessing a damaged product. Hoa glanced down, smoothed the fabric with one hand, then looked up. Thank you for pointing it out, she said evenly, her gaze unflinching. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met the woman's steady and calm before she turned away. The pearls gleamed under the light, but the woman's smile faltered. More voices joined the chorus. From a corner table, a tech entrepreneur too young for his wealth raised his glass. Must be rough, huh? Serving people like us all night. You ever get tired of this gig? His table mates chuckled, eyes glittering. Hoa paused with her tray, her hand resting on a dessert plate. She looked at him, her voice soft but clear. It's honest work. The words, plain and quiet, landed heavier than a shout. The entrepreneur shifted in his seat, his laugh brittle as glass. But Victor wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice rising so the entire room could hear. She probably doesn't even understand us. Just hurry with the food so she doesn't waste my time. Lucas snickered, nodding, playing his part in the theater of arrogance. A ripple of laughter followed from nearby tables, though softer this time, unsure. The room was changing, its current unsettled. Hoa returned with the dishes. Not one mistake. She placed the duck confit, the sea bass, the pasta, each dish perfect, each plate aligned with care. Then she slipped a handwritten card next to Victor's plate, the script neat, precise, every ingredient listed in English and German. I learned this recipe from the head chef in Hamburg, she said, her voice calm, her German flawless. Back when you dined there regularly. Victor's fork froze halfway to his mouth. The smirk on Lucas's face collapsed. Across the restaurant, the woman in velvet leaned closer to her date, whispering too loudly, "Did she just say Hamburg?" Heads turned. Phones lifted discreetly. The air thickened with electricity. Victor set down his fork, his jaw tightening. But before he could speak, another voice cut through. The fashion influencer in a sleek black dress leaned from her table, diamond earrings flashing. "Excuse me, dear," she called, her tone high and mocking. "That watch of yours, isn't it a bit outdated? Doesn't fit the vibe here." Her friends giggled, phones poised, ready to capture the waitress's humiliation for their feeds. Hoa glanced at the old silver watch on her wrist, her father's gift, scratched but still ticking. She looked back at the influencer, her voice steady. "It keeps time." That was all. No apology, no defense. Just 3 words, soft but unshakable. The influencer laughed, but the sound wavered. Her friend's smiles faltered as Hoa turned away, her steps calm, her head high. Phones lowered, uncertain. For the first time that night, the laughter thinned, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the insults. But Victor Reinhardt wasn't a man who surrendered his dominance. He leaned forward, his voice cutting, each word deliberate. "Perhaps you were a server in Germany, and you still are. Speaking well doesn't change your status." Lucas added quickly, "Yes, nobody with wealth works tables." Their words struck like knives, meant to draw blood. The crowd leaned in, and still, Hoa Karen stood steady, her hands folded, her face unreadable. The humiliation had reached its peak, the room buzzing like a live wire. Everyone waited for her to break, to defend, to prove them right. Instead, she simply met Victor's eyes, calm as stone. And in that silence, heavy and taut, the night bent toward revelation. The silence in La Lumiere was not natural. It was sharp, deliberate, like the moment before a storm strikes. Victor Reinhardt leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed, his jaw tight. His assistant Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his smirk finally slipping. They had built a spectacle of mockery, but the audience no longer laughed. They were waiting, restless, sensing something beneath the surface. Hoa Karen stood still, her black uniform plain against the backdrop of jeweled gowns and tailored suits. The old silver watch on her wrist caught the chandelier's light, a tiny glint in the heavy air. She didn't flinch, she didn't speak. She simply let the silence grow until even the clinking of cutlery at other tables stopped. And then, with a calm voice as steady as water, she spoke in flawless German. "Mr. Reinhardt," she said softly, her tone polite but firm. "2 years ago, in Munich, you told the chef that this wine should breathe for exactly 12 minutes, no more." The words cut sharper than glass. Victor froze, his wine glass suspended midair. Around him, murmurs rose. Guests exchanged looks, their eyes darting between the billionaire and the waitress who had just recited his own memory back to him. It was impossible unless she had been there. Hoa's gaze did not waver. I was there that day. I remember it well. Lucas's lips parted, but no sound came. The smirk that had lived on his face all evening vanished, replaced with a flicker of unease. A couple at the next table leaned in, whispering. The woman in velvet, once amused, now sat upright, her fork forgotten. The air was electric, every second stretching longer than it should. Victor set his glass down. Too hard. The stem trembling. He tried to recover. His voice clipped. So you served in Munich too? And you still are. He forced a smile, cold and thin, but the edge in his tone betrayed him. Hoa didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron. The room inhaled as one, expecting notes, a bill, perhaps even a mistake to cling to. But when her hand emerged, it held a phone, its screen glowing faintly under the golden light. She swiped once, turned it toward Victor, and let him see. An email. The logo of Reinhardt Global Bank. A chain of digital signatures from the board. Proof. Undeniable. Her voice, still soft, carried across the room. I am the second largest shareholder of Reinhardt Global. The words landed like thunder. Gasps broke out across the restaurant. The hedge fund broker who had mocked her lemon twist dropped his glass with a sharp crack. The influencer's phone slipped from her manicured fingers, clattering onto the floor. Even the servers froze, their trays balanced midair, as though the world itself had paused to listen. Victor's face drained of color. His hand gripped the tablecloth until his knuckles whitened. Lucas stared at the email, his fingers twitching as if trying to reach for it, to erase it, to undo the moment. But it was too late. The revelation was alive, spilling through the air, already being whispered from table to table. Phones lifted, screens glowed. Some guests were recording, others sending frantic messages. The story was leaving the restaurant before the dessert could reach the tables. But Hoa didn't linger on the proof. She slid the phone back into her apron, her movements slow, deliberate, unshaken. Then she spoke again, her German flawless, her tone still polite, but edged with steel. You mocked my watch, she said, her eyes turning briefly toward the influencer's table. It belonged to my father, who taught me that dignity has nothing to do with diamonds. Her gaze swept to the woman in pearls, who had called out her stained apron. You noticed a mark on fabric, but not the stains arrogance leaves behind. The woman's smile faltered, her pearls suddenly heavy around her neck. Finally, Hoa turned back to Victor. And you assumed I was here because I had nowhere else to be. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady. I am here because my mother loves this restaurant's dessert. Every head turned. In the far corner, under softer light, sat an older woman with silver hair, pulled into a neat bun. She was dressed simply, her face warm, her eyes filled with pride. Hoa Karen. She raised a hand, smiling softly, as if to say she had been watching all along. The silence shifted. It was no longer heavy with cruelty, it was thick with awe. Some guests murmured, others stared, their own reflections suddenly uncomfortable in the polished silverware. Victor tried to speak, but his voice cracked. This is nonsense, yet even he heard how hollow it sounded. Lucas opened his mouth, but no words came. Their power had evaporated, drained by the quiet dignity of a woman they thought invisible. Hoa did not wait for their response. She turned, her apron brushing the table as she walked away, her steps steady, unhurried. Each movement carried the weight of choice, not escape, but command. The room parted around her without being asked. The woman in velvet put down her fork and whispered, She just destroyed him. Her date nodded mutely, eyes fixed on Victor's pale face. The hedge fund broker shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his tie. The influencer sat frozen, her phone forgotten at her feet. The spell of superiority had broken, and the shards cut deepest, where arrogance had lived longest. At the bar, Hoa passed Marco, the young server who had watched the night unravel with wide eyes. He leaned toward her, whispering, Are you okay? She gave him the smallest of smiles, enough to show gratitude. I'm fine, she said softly, Her hand brushed against the photo tucked in her apron, her and her mother, laughing in Central Park years ago. She let her fingers rest on it for a moment, a private reminder that her strength was not for the crowd, but for the woman in the corner, smiling through the pain of illness. Back at Victor's table, silence reigned. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms could not command this room. He reached for his wine, his hand trembling. Lucas stared at his plate as if the food itself accused him. Around them, whispers spread faster than fire in dry grass. Did you hear what she said? She's on the board. She owns shares. Oh my God, Reinhardt just got humiliated. By the time dessert reached the other tables, the narrative had shifted. The waitress was no longer invisible. She was a storm wrapped in silence, a truth that no wealth could hide. And everyone knew it. The night had turned, and the humiliation no longer belonged to her. It belonged to them. The tension inside La Lumiere had reached a knife's edge. Conversations that once flowed like expensive wine had dried up, leaving only the brittle sound of forks resting idly against porcelain. Victor Reinhardt sat stiff, his glass of Bordeaux untouched, his face pale under the golden chandelier. Lucas Myers shifted nervously, his smirk long gone, eyes darting toward the exit as if he could flee the weight of silence pressing down. But silence in a room like this never lasted. It demanded to be broken. From a table near the bar, a venture capitalist in a gray blazer leaned back, smirking as if to rescue the evening from collapse. You know, he said, his voice pitched loud enough to ripple across the hushed restaurant, a place like this is about atmosphere. Servers do better when they smile more. Customers like a friendly face. His companions chuckled, relieved to have cruelty return like an old friend. Their laughter was brittle, desperate, but it was enough to draw eyes back to Hoa Karen. She approached calmly, her water pitcher balanced in one hand. She poured with steady precision, the liquid catching the light as though the room itself bent to her rhythm. Then, without raising her voice, she looked at the man and said, I smile when it's earned. The words landed with a weight far heavier than their softness suggested. The chuckles died. The man blinked, shifting in his chair. His table mates stared into their glasses, pretending to find the swirl of wine more interesting than the woman who had just dismantled arrogance with 6 quiet words. The air thickened again. Guests leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something beyond an ordinary evening. Phones hovered discreetly, screens glowing as whispers turned into digital shadows ready to escape into the world. Victor, desperate to reclaim control, leaned in, his voice sharp. If what you say is true, he sneered in German, then you wouldn't be working here. A shareholder doesn't carry plates. Lucas nodded quickly, latching onto the thread. Yes, nobody with that kind of wealth waits tables. His tone carried venom, but also fear, as though he already knew the argument was slipping. Hoa set the water pitcher down gently, folding her hands in front of her apron. She didn't blink, didn't frown. Instead, she tilted her head, her voice soft but unyielding. I work here, she said, her German clear as glass, because my mother loves the dessert. It was a simple sentence, but its echo filled every corner of the room. Dozens of eyes turned again toward the far corner, where Eleanor Karen sat. Her silver hair glowed beneath the chandelier, her smile warm, her eyes wet with quiet pride. She lifted her hand, a small wave of acknowledgement, as if blessing the entire evening with her presence. The impact was immediate. Guests shifted uncomfortably, shame flickering in their eyes. Those who had laughed earlier now found the floor fascinating. Even the influencer in diamonds lowered her phone, her cheeks flushed. Victor's voice trembled when he spoke. This is absurd. But his tone betrayed him. The certainty he wielded in boardrooms had abandoned him here. Hoa stepped closer, her gaze steady, her voice calm enough to chill the room. You value appearances, Mr. Reinhardt, but appearances do not decide truth. Character does. She let the words hang, each syllable cutting deeper than raised voices ever could. The chandeliers seemed to burn brighter. The soft jazz from the corner piano had long since stopped, leaving her voice as the only music. Then she added, almost gently, and tonight, character is what this room is remembering. Gasps rippled. A woman in velvet pressed her hand to her mouth. The hedge fund broker who had mocked her lemon twist shifted, his face red. The influencer fumbled for her phone again, not to record, but to hide her shaking hands. Even the fashion mogul in pearls bowed her head slightly, her earlier venom curdled into silence. The storm had broken, and the lightning was Hoa Karen herself. But Victor was not a man to go quietly. His pride clawed for breath. He slammed his palm against the table, rattling the silverware. Enough! His voice cracked like thunder, desperate, commanding. You think you can humiliate me? You think this makes you powerful? Every eye turned to him, but not in awe, in pity. Hoa did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, her hands folded. Power, she said, isn't in who speaks the loudest. It's in who doesn't need to. The chandeliers seemed to flicker. Victor's jaw worked furiously, but no words came. Lucas tried to fill the void, stammering, She's bluffing. She's nothing. But his voice cracked, brittle as glass, and nobody believed him. Then the final blow fell, not from Hoa's lips, but from the room itself. A young girl at a nearby table tugged at her mother's sleeve, her whisper carrying farther than intended. Mom, is that the lady from the video? The mother, dressed simply among the glittering crowd, nodded. Yes, she said softly. She's the one who stood up to that man. Gasps swept through the tables. Phones flashed. The truth was no longer contained within the walls of La Lumiere. It was already spreading, a wildfire leaping from screen to screen, carried by those who had witnessed the night firsthand. Victor sank back into his chair, his face ashen. Lucas looked at the floor, his hands trembling. The empire of arrogance they had built so confidently was collapsing in real time, undone not by shouts or fists, but by the steady, quiet dignity of a woman they had dismissed as nothing. Hoa Karen turned away, her apron brushing lightly against the linen as she moved. Her steps were slow, deliberate, unshaken. The silence behind her was deafening, broken only by the whispered tide of respect that followed her path. In the far corner, Eleanor Karen smiled, her eyes shining with pride and love. For her daughter, for the strength she carried, for the lessons she had just carved into the soul of the night. And so the climax was not a scream, not a fight, not even a single dramatic gesture. It was a revelation, clear and unshakable, that true power comes not from money, not from arrogance, but from the unyielding grace of character. And every person in La Lumiere knew they would remember it for the rest of their lives. By the next morning, the night at La Lumiere had already slipped beyond the velvet curtains of the restaurant and into the veins of the world. The video was everywhere, shaky phone footage of a plain waitress dismantling a billionaire with nothing more than her calm voice and a few undeniable truths. Never judge a book by its cover, one caption read. Another, she didn't just serve him dinner, she served him humility. Within hours, millions of people had seen Hoa Karen stand unflinching in the face of arrogance. The consequences came quietly, but they came swiftly. Victor Reinhardt vanished from public view, skipping events he once commanded. His name trended for all the wrong reasons. Reinhardt, humiliated by owned shareholder. Satirical memes spread across finance blogs, each one harsher than the last. Lucas Meyer, his assistant, tried to laugh it off online, posting that the incident had been overblown drama. The comments tore him apart. By the end of the week, his account was gone, and so was his job. The others who had joined in that night's mockery fared no better. The woman in pearls, a real estate mogul once invited to every gala, found doors closed. Her sponsors withdrew. The fashion influencer who mocked Hoa's watch lost a lucrative brand deal after her smirking face was replayed millions of times next to Hoa's calm reply. The hedge fund broker whose voice had carried the lemon twist insult lost a major client who simply wrote, "I don't like that kind of attitude." It wasn't loud, it wasn't revenge. It was the truth catching up, quiet, inevitable, unstoppable. And through it all, Hoa Karen remained exactly where she had been. She arrived at the restaurant each evening with her uniform pressed, her hair tied back, her silver watch ticking softly. She moved between the tables with steady grace, pouring wine, clearing plates, her face calm. The staff who had once seen her as ordinary now treated her differently, not with awe, but with respect. Marco, the young server who had whispered concern the night before, began saving her a seat during breaks. The chefs set aside small plates from their experimental dishes for her to taste, Even Tony, the manager who rarely smiled, pulled her aside one evening and handed her a small envelope. "It's from the staff," he muttered, his gruff voice awkward. "A bonus. For what you did." Hoa took it, her fingers brushing the paper, and gave him a nod. "Thank you, Tony." She tucked it into her apron and went back to work. Tony stood for a long moment, watching her go, something like pride softening his usual scowl. The restaurant itself began to feel different. Regulars who once ignored her now greeted her with quiet warmth. Some left notes with their tips. "You're an inspiration. Thank you for reminding us what matters." She didn't dwell on them, but she kept a few tucked into the same pocket as the photo of her and her mother, folded and worn. Hoa Karen returned to her favorite corner often, her smile softer now, her eyes proud. She and Hoa would share a slice of chocolate torte in silence, hands sometimes touching across the table. Guests watched them, but this time, it wasn't with judgment or condescension. It was respect. The story grew larger than the restaurant. Business magazines wrote profiles. The shareholder who chose humility. Social media spun threads about dignity, about the quiet strength of those who refuse to bow to arrogance. And yet, Hoa never commented, never posted, never added her voice. The story lived its own life, teaching its own lessons. She didn't need to guide it. Then one evening, weeks later, a new figure entered La Lumiere. Tall, quiet, wearing a suit understated but undeniably expensive. Conversations softened when he walked in, as though the room instinctively recognized a presence that did not need to announce itself. He asked for a table in Hoa's section, his voice low, polite. He was Daniel Mueller, Hoa's husband, a name spoken in boardrooms with the kind of respect that wealth alone could never buy. When Hoa approached, her steps steady as always, she set a glass of water in front of him. Their hands brushed, briefly, deliberately. He looked up at her with eyes softened by pride, and she smiled a small, real smile, the kind that was earned. It was enough. The room understood. At a nearby table, the woman in the red velvet dress who had once mocked Hoa stared, her fork frozen halfway to her lips. Across the room, the hedge fund broker kept his gaze on his plate, his face tight. None of them raised their voices. None dared. Respect had shifted in the room, and everyone knew who held it. Still, Hoa never changed her rhythm. She continued working, continued moving through the tables like she always had. One night, a new customer came in, a woman in her 60s, wearing a worn coat, sitting alone. She ordered only a coffee. Her hands trembled as she folded them on the table. Hoa brought the coffee, set it down gently, then noticed the woman's tired eyes. "Long day?" Hoa asked softly. The woman gave a tired smile. "Long life." Hoa slipped a small plate of cookies next to the coffee. "No charge," she said, then walked away. The woman left a crumpled $5 bill and a note. "Thank you for seeing me." Hoa tucked the note into her apron, next to the photo of her and her mother, and continued her shift. Outside, the world still spun with headlines and noise. Inside La Lumiere, Hoa remained the same, steady, quiet, graceful. Her strength wasn't in exposing Victor Reinhardt, nor in the millions of views her story had earned. It was in the simple truth that she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. And perhaps that was the real revelation. That power doesn't come from diamonds or wealth or the loudness of a voice. It comes from the way one carries themselves when the world tries to make them small. On her wrist, the silver watch ticked on, its scratched face catching the chandelier's glow. In the corner, Eleanor smiled, savoring her dessert, her eyes soft with peace. And in the quiet hum of the restaurant, Hoa Karen moved, unseen by some, unforgettable to others. Her story didn't end with applause or headlines. It ended with her steady steps, her calm hands, and the dignity that had turned humiliation into truth. And for those who had watched that night, who had felt the silence break like thunder, the lesson would remain. You don't need to shout to be powerful. You just need to stand steady and let the world see who you are. The tale of Hoa Karen reminds us that true strength doesn't come from wealth, status, or the noise of arrogance. It comes from the quiet dignity of standing firm when others try to diminish you. In a world obsessed with appearances, She proved that character speaks louder than diamonds, louder than laughter, louder than power itself. Her story is not about humiliation, but revelation. That respect is earned not by what you own, but by who you are when the room is against you. So when life places you in the shadows, remember shadows are not weakness. Sometimes they carry the brightest truths.